Just takes me a while to get the computer to respond. So for anyone who's joining us online, thank you for coming as well. And I'm going to record this session. Like I said, I try to make it possible that if you cannot come to the class, if you're sick, then please do not come. Please do not get others sick and so on. I'll try to make something available online. But having said that as well, we're supposed to move on to fully face-to-face. So next week. So if there is a reason, I will work with you and I will try to figure out a way that you can still attend. But let's do our best to do from next week onwards face-to-face classes. It helps especially with the spot tests and dissections and practical things such as that. No need to be in person today. I've got a question from online. Today is okay to attend remotely, but I appreciate anyone who joined in person as well. So what I was sharing while we were getting started with the class was that next week we'll kind of get to, or this week, today's session will start with the material that's actually first chapter of your textbook. And it's the first chapter that's actually included in your future tests and so on. And then the next week I had scheduled that we would take a spot test. The spot test is just a kind of like a quiz. But it's a quiz that usually is used in anatomy and physiology, that you identify structures or you identify things that relate to those structures. So kind of getting away from using diagrams and doing paper exams or exams on a screen. So it's a little more hands-on. And I think that since I had scheduled the first spot test there, if we can, we'll try to do that. But we'll do it just as a class. So it gives you a chance to like really excel and get good points for that and all that good stuff. Also, the other thing that I shared with the class, with the students who were here in person, is that we will kind of today also refer back to some of the core concepts that we discussed about last week. So we'll use a handout that I prepared, and I'm not going to be uploading this handout on the Blackboard simply because I used to do these. And eventually, if you go through every chapter of the textbook, you have like a mini version of the textbook. And then I was doing those, and somewhere in a professional setting, someone was like, I've got a really good summary book to sell for you about the materials. And they sold me my own handouts. And I was like, I'm not going to do that anymore. So I only give them out as a paper version. If you're joining us remotely, you'll get the paper version then next time we meet. But that's the logic behind that. I'm trying to think, is there anything else I'm supposed to talk about? What I'd like to do is jump right onto it. Is that okay? Do you have any questions? Other thing that I kind of realized now that I said it for the students in the class, but not online, that when we meet next Tuesday, it's probably going to be only for an hour and a half, just simply because I've got another appointment that I got to be present for the college community. So that's just something that we'll navigate. I'm going to try to share the screen on both. So bear with me as I get set up. So what I thought we'd do today, we would start all the way from the beginning. Are you able to see the screen properly? I was trying to figure out, should I dim the lights or not? I'm worried when I start dimming the lights, students start falling asleep, including me. So are you okay to see, or do you prefer a little more dimmed? I'm okay to do either one, but I have no guarantees that it will work. This is really not my strong point. I can do a lot of other stuff, but Operating classroom lights is one of the challenges I face, and I don't think I did the back, not the front. I don't know. We'll just make do what we can. And if you can't see at some point, let me know. So I guess that's a good place for us to start. And while I'm going through the lecture, you might find some answers to this, but at the same time, if that's not your way of learning, if you prefer to write your own notes, or if you prefer just to listen, that's totally fine. But what I thought that we should start with is to probably first of all talk that what are we doing here in this class? What is anatomy? What is physiology? And all that kind of a good stuff. But really, before we jump even to that, one thing that you'll notice on our classes is that we'll use a lot of weird words. And a lot of those weird words initially when you're starting feel like, why are we just making life more difficult than it has to be? And I'm going to be honest, that's kind of part of it. Part of it is that anatomy and physiology has a history that goes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to the back to the history. So some of those terms that you've seen people or see people using today come from ancient Greek or Latin languages, and they have just stuck. And the reason why they have stuck is that it's super easy if we don't speak same language, but we have names for body structures that are understood regardless of the language that you use. So a lot of the Latin words are, and in biology in general, a way for us to make sure that we're being very precise and very accurate when we're communicating between people from different fields or different backgrounds. So we always know that we're talking of the same muscle. So you almost need to learn the English name, and then you sometimes need to learn the alternative name that you see being used. I try not to do that too much, but if the English name makes no sense, that might be the explanation for that. The other thing is that we love, I think that in general, the entire field of sciences is the language where we use names of dead old white men. There's obviously a bit of an ethical issue even with that, and a bit of an inclusivity issue and so on. But normally when someone discovered a condition or a body part or something, they get to have the first dibs of what shall we call it. And you'll see a lot of things called Alzheimer's disease and so on and so on. So they're named after someone, and unfortunately it was mainly dead old white men who are dead now. They weren't dead at that time when they were naming things that got to name a lot of this stuff. Then we see other thing that we love to do in medical field is to abbreviate things. So that's another thing. And sometimes those abbreviations stop being abbreviations and they become words that are commonly used. Is anyone taking medical terminology class? Not yet. Yes, some. And we'll have to take. So medical terminology class is the weirdest class. This is not something that I'm expecting you to know. I'm just sharing. It's like a AMP 1 and 2 on steroids. You go through everything, but at the same time, you don't go through anything in detail. So you go through the words that we use. And then the fourth one that I was going to show, what happens a lot of the time is that when new techniques, new methods come available, we introduce those terms to the medical language as well. So my background, like I shared, is in medical imaging and especially using MRI scanners, but magnetic resonance imaging wasn't the term we always used. Really, if you look at the history and what we do, it's nuclear imaging. But because people get freaked out when we talk about nuclear stuff, we stopped using it and we just replaced it with something else. So sometimes you can see that those terms come from the techniques and methods that develop. I'm not asking you to memorize any of these. I'm just wanting to show you. If you go to nursing, if you go to medicine, if you go to other healthcare areas, you will end up seeing a lot of abbreviations. I guess I'm just trying to prove you that I'm not making it up. It's a real thing that happens. So there's a lot of just shorthand to condense the notes that we take, make note taking fast, and so on. But those very, once you get into it, very universal and very well followed. So you'll end up seeing that we do a lot of that. Where I wanted to go with all this is really long path there, is that what are we doing here? What are we studying when we're studying anatomy and physiology? Does anyone want to shout out? Just like, I prefer when we're more chatting than me talking to you. What is anatomy? Do you know? Study of the body. You're on the right thing. Like, I'm always, if you don't know any other answer in a biology class, say on Earth. It's probably right. It's somewhere in the Earth. So you're absolutely right. It's about human body, and we're studying human body, but anatomy and physiology differ. Anatomy is studying the structure of the human body. So other thing that you sometimes see us using is that we describe it as study of the form of the human body. So if we look at, and you have, some of you have skeleton models in front of you, some of you will have in a bit. A good example of anatomy would be that we study how the bones in a joint come together. What kind of a bone surfaces do we need to have that our shoulder joint is able to do all the things that it does? What sort of bones do we have there? What ligaments, what tendons, what kind of a blood supply, what nerves. So it's all about structures that come to that body part. So a form of the body. So now that we've gotten the anatomy figured out, that gives us a clue what physiology is all about. Any ideas?
How it works.
Perfect. How it works or function of the body. So we're looking at no longer of those individual bones, no longer at what muscles we have, but we're looking at what kind of a movement can you do, for example, with a shoulder joint. What kind of range of motion we have for that, and so on and so on. So really, I think it's dumb, and I say this is a person who studied anatomy and not physiology, anatomy for 8 years in the university. It's dumb that we would study those two separately. Because really, to understand the structure, why you have stuff built the way it is, you need to know what it's going to do. Otherwise, it's like, well, studying names of animals without knowing what the animals look like. But then, to understand physiology, you can't really understand how something works unless you know what it's made of. So those two go together very closely. So we often thought in anatomy and physiology that form and function are related. You cannot have a certain form if you don't have function for it. And function cannot be understood without understanding the form of a structure. Does that make sense? I know that it's like really basic, but I just want to kind of, let's ease ourselves in. So anatomy, all about structure. Physiology, all about how it works. I liked your definition better than what I had. I had like action, and I was like, that's not really good way of describing it. So now that we've gotten those two, we are left with one more to consider. And before we jump into what pathology is, let's just be honest what you'll learn in this class and in Bio202. You'll learn all about healthy young adult body. We look very much at baby, very little spend time looking at babies, and we spend very little time looking at old people. We just look at like a young adult who's in the prime of their life and has nothing wrong with them. We'll learn all that stuff. But if any of you, and I did read all of those, and I'm going to get back to it later on all of those nicely introductory posts. Thank you for doing those. If any of you is planning to go to medical, how often are you going to get a patient who comes to, I'm healthy young adult, let's discuss what's going on with you? Never. So why on earth are we doing it then? Just show them.
Because you can know what's normal, you know what's not.
Exactly. So pathology is the study of diseases and study of things going wrong, but you can't really understand pathology until you know what's normal shape, what's normal structure, and what's normal function, what's normal actions. So really all of these classes are just giving you foundations so you can move on to your pathology classes. I'll try to throw in every now and then, especially when it's important, things about development and so on. I spent years at university on my postgrad focusing on embryonic research. So what happens to human being from the moment it's conceived to about 6 to 8 weeks of their life, when it's just a ball of cells. And that's something that I'm very interested in, but something that's not going to be really important for most of you when you go to the medical field. So I'll try to bring in examples, but not to dwell on it too much. We feel good about all of those 3 terms? Awesome. The other thing that I kind of should share with you is that when we're studying anatomy and physiology, it's such a broad field. You'll never find someone in university who says that, what's your field? And, oh, I just study anatomy and physiology. It's too much. It's like saying, I study biology. People choose special areas that they're interested in. You rarely find someone who does it all. So again, anatomy and physiology, we can study it on many levels of scale. We can study the cell structure, we can study tissue structure, or we can study gross anatomy, which is like what you see, the big structures with naked eye. I'm going to be honest, I will teach you both, but I'm biased. I'm like, if I can't see it with the naked eye, I don't care. No, I do have to care, because sometimes to understand how muscles work, you need to know the microscopic structure. But I'm all about, personally, things that are visible to a naked eye. But we will have to dabble on both and go back and forth. And this, if I remember correctly, my slides, it's all a blur to me, brings us nicely to talk about something that we kind of visited, not in a great detail, but we kind of visited last week. The different scales of studying of life. I don't think I'm going to ask about this, but I wanted to share about it anyways. So it's kind of a reminder, and it nicely aligns with what you have on your handout about the levels of organization. So we can study things at the level of atoms. And you remember, we could go into smaller stuff as well than atoms. The subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons. And then when you had multiple atoms, 2 or more that came together, they made up a molecule. If you had big molecules, they were macromolecules. And then we get to the level of cells. Well, cells are the smallest independently existing unit of life, but even cells themselves are made of cells. And what cells were made of were, of course, the cellular organisms, or cell organelles. Let me get my words right. Cell organelles. So all of those stuff that we discussed about nucleus, mitochondria, chloroplast, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, filaments, cytoplasm, vacuoles, vesicles, all that good stuff. So cell organelles themselves are not able to survive without help of other cell organelles. But cell was the level of life where it could survive on its own. And once you took a bunch of cells and put them together, it made up a tissue. And once you had tissues that were in same area of the body, kind of working for same region or reason, same purpose, that made up our organs. And then you could have multiple organs that all were going for a same reason. Think of digestive system. You have liver, you have stomach, you have intestines, you have gallbladder, you have pancreas. All of those different organs working for the same purpose are an organ system. And human is made of multiple different organ systems. So if you're made of multiple different organ systems, you're an existing organism. So I guess that the term that I would throw in there is that you're an organism. We'll have a look what I've written like when I wrote this year ago together a little later. So I think it's a kind of a nice way to remind ourselves why we did that revision and how we ended up here. I know that some students were really worried that the quiz that I had was super tough. As long as you tried it, you'll get full marks towards your final grade. I promise. I just haven't had a chance to go and update it. I think the other thing that I have, and it's listed a little differently than on your handout, so don't worry about too much. Again, and not necessarily the thing that I would ask in an exam, but just reminding us, we talked about what is life, life is, or what is biology, biology is study of life, and what makes something alive. Well, there are certain characteristics we find that are shared with things that are alive. Whether it's humans, whether it's animals, whether it's plants, whether it's microbes, many different things. So again, nothing that I would really ask in a great detail from you, but things that I kind of just wanted to share. And I know that I forgot totally to move the slides on the students who were attending. Sorry. So what I'd like to do next, oh, and we also talked about the homeostasis. You remember this diagram? I think my one is a little simpler than this, but the concept is the same, right? About homeostasis, we talked about that, right? Yes. I don't know what I've talked about anymore. I was like, if you don't react, then we're going to talk about it again. Let's not do that. So we talked about how there's a chains of some kind. We notice it with the receptor, message gets passed to the control center where we have a set point, and then we have a vector that acts to bring us back to the normal stage. Before we jump into this diagram of this dude or girl, I don't know which one, who's standing kind of weird, one thing that I do think we could talk about is about the different body systems. So what we'll do on this course is that we'll look at, this first chapter is different, but after this chapter, every other chapter looks at different body systems that your body is made of. And we go through them one by one. I think we'll start with skin and associated structures like nails, hairs, glands. Then we'll move on, I think, to the skeleton. And then we'll move on to the muscular system. And then we'll move on to nervous system. And then this semester and this course is over. And then you'll continue with others later on. Other systems in later on Bio 202. But that's a little weird way of learning things, but that's what we're going to do. And the reason why it's a weird way of learning things is because no system exists by themselves. Shall we try to list as many systems as we can? What systems do we have? And I'll come back to this handout that I have on the screen, so don't panic if you don't see everything just yet, or don't have notes of everything just yet. I will come back to it. And I'll try to share it also here. But I think it would be good that we try to list as many body systems as we can. And let's stick here. I'm going to open it on your screens as well. gonna stop here. So there's some of the systems that, or there are all of the systems that we are made of. I'm trying not to walk too far from the microphones. So depending a little bit on the textbook, depending a little bit who you ask from, it can be 11, it can be 12 systems. So you have integumentary system, which was all about skin and all that other good stuff that goes with it. Then you've got skeletal system, so your bones. But one thing that we'll notice when we study bones is that skeleton is much more, and skeletal system is much more than just a framework where everything else is hanging. Skeleton actually is actively, constantly changing. Parts of it are taken apart and parts are rebuilt. Your blood cells are made at the skeleton, and so on. So it's much more active than we often think about. We'll talk about muscular system. So we'll look at the 3 different kinds of muscle tissue that we had, but we'll focus on the skeletal muscles. Then we'll talk about digestive system, respiratory system, and urinary system. So all systems that receive stuff to the body, take something away from it, and get rid of the rest. And we'll talk about cardiovascular system and lymphatic system. Cardiovascular system I'm especially partial for, because that's what I've spent most of my career working on. We'll also get to talk about nervous system and endocrine system. So endocrine system is all about hormones. That's all it is. And then finally about reproductive system. Any guesses? There's one of these systems that you can live without. All others, if you lose it, you'll die. Reproductive, yeah. All other systems you need, but reproductive system, if you don't have that, that won't be great. So I really struggle with this way of teaching you to be like, oh, we're only going to talk about one system and then you think that it exists on its own, because they're all connected. So for that reason, I was feeling really guilty that am I misleading you? I prepared this little handout. I'm not going to test you on it. It's just to show you that everything's connected. All systems are connected to other systems. So that's all I'm trying to do with that, showing that you can't really have a system existing by themselves, and you can't really have a system that wouldn't rely on other systems. So that's all I'm trying to do with this. Don't worry, we won't go through all of these on Bio 201. We'll only go through a few of them on 201, and then we'll go through the rest on 202. That's AMP1 and AMP2, if someone was like, what? So I think that that's all I wanted to say about the body systems at this stage. Do you have any questions about anything we've talked so far? Yes? This handout? Oh, it's somewhere floating around on the table. Just grab one. Sorry, I was meaning to tell you. You can have those. So normally I'll try to have the handouts on table when you come in, but sometimes I'm running late. I come from a couple of hours away, sometimes here. I teach all over the state. So sometimes it's a push, but normally I'm pretty organized. Also, please make sure that you sign into this class. The sign-in sheet is there. At some point, it doesn't have to be now, but at some point, so you get the attendance. I think if you hadn't gotten your attendance, you would have been already dropped from this class. And it has some consequences, but I don't know what they are. Just try to do that the best you can. Any other questions? That was a really good question. Oh, I should have shared that when you came in. Any other questions? This is like my weakest thing to try to navigate multiple systems. So let's see if I'm able to do that. So everyone should be seeing this diagram of a person that's standing here, facing forward, face facing forward, legs kind of together, pointing forward, toes hands on its side, palms facing towards you. That's a weird position to stand in, right? Do you ever stand like this? No one does. But that's what we call anatomical position. Okay, what good does that do? So one of the problems we ran into early on when we started studying human body, anatomy and physiology, and I'm talking about we as a field. I was not around hundreds and hundreds of years ago, that when we try to describe a part of the body or a structure, it's really hard to be accurate so that what you think is going to be same as what I think. If I say, oh, it's like a couple of inches up from here and to the left, it soon gets really muddy. That what are we talking about? I think the best way to explain it is to go to the example. Like I said, I used to work a lot with forensic work. So we had bodies, human bodies that we found, and we had to write medical reports of them. But it's hard to explain where the injury is because every human body is in a different position when you find them dead, right? So then me saying go to the left means nothing. So what we do in medical field is that we use this particular diagram that you see now, or this position that you see in this diagram, called anatomical position, as an agreed template of what the person looks like when we talk about it. So it's like a shared map that it's easy then to say that what is front, what is back. Even on the front side of the body, there was an injury. Well, is it front if I'm lying to the ground? Does it mean the front for me or front for the viewer? Or how about the hands? Which side of the hands is front? Which is back? So we've just agreed that this is always the front and this is always the back. And we just use that even no matter what position you really are in, but we use it as an agreed template. So if we get that body and it's missing an arm and its head has been turned 180 around, we still assume when we talk in the medical records as if that body was standing in that position. Does that kind of make sense? That was a really long-winded explanation, I feel, of the concept that I wanted to. So that's really the position that you'll see us using all the time. And that's also the position that you see all of these half skeletons that I've gotten to you. And I'll try to get probably more, or then you might need to work in pairs, but I'll probably try to get more. If you look at them, they all stand in anatomical position, right? And that's simply because that is the assumed standard position when we're learning AMP and when we're teaching about it and when we're recording something in medical literature. I'm just looking if there's anything else that I was supposed to tell you. I try to make notes what I'm planning to talk about. Does anyone have any questions about anatomical position or anything else that we've covered so far? Yes?
So I took EBIT, and how we learned with this is that from how we're looking at them, our left side is their right side. So everything on that side is labeled right, right?
So you're thinking exactly right. I have an easier way even. So this is the standard position of the body. And this is what we've learned so far. We're all in agreement of that, right? But when you talk about the patient and you're saying that, oh, there was an injury on the right shoulder, well, then it becomes an issue, like you said. Is it what looks right to me of that patient or whatever? So whenever we use language to describe right, left, up, down, so on, we are talking as if we were the patient. So always assume that, okay, so when I'm talking about right shoulder, how would that patient be? And what's their right shoulder? That was a really good clarification. I was going to go there later, but that's actually, this is the best time to talk about that. So we'll be talking about heart, for example, in Bio202. And I'm going to divide heart into 4 different chambers. And I'll talk about right and left chamber. And the right chamber of the heart is going to be on this side. So it's your left, but we still call it right because it's the patient's right. And it's really, really messy if you start adding words patients or viewers or this. So we just always think as if you were the patient. But if you're a patient and you're missing your limbs, we still talk about as if you were in that position. That was a really good point. Any other questions or comments? No? Anyone feels overwhelmed at this point? Fairly basic, fairly good, straightforward. What I want to do next, we're going to start going through some language. And there's going to be a fair bit of language. Initially, it might seem like, again, I'm torturing you or just making life more difficult than it is. It's not my goal. I absolutely promise you that's not what I'm about. That's not my game. To learn these terms now will save you so much time and so much effort when you do medical terminology, when you go to pathology classes, when you start studying any other human biology field. So when I was a student, I was like, do I really need to care about this beyond passing the exam? I would say, please do it now, because you'll notice that soon, all of the language that we use is just playing around with the same words. And if you learn them, you don't spend time later on trying to catch up on those. So we're going to talk about different directions of the body. And we're going to go through them, and you'll notice that there's a very specific language for that. Just let me get some space on the board. And I noticed that this book doesn't wipe out really well, so we'll do our best. So just like you have directions in math or geometry, you have x-axis, y-axis, z-axis, and so on. I'm already like zoned out. Math, tough. A&P, fun. We have the same directions in anatomy and physiology, but we're not going to use all of those letters. We have specific terms that we use for them. I'm just going to have a look here. I don't think I have anything to project on that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to write a few things on board. And if you're joining remotely, I will take a picture and upload the things as well on the Blackboard. Let's start with and if at some point you can't read my writing, please let me know, because I have really bad handwriting. That's the first thing you learn in a med school, that you write badly. No, that's a requirement to get in. No, so we never say that a certain structure in A&P is above another or below another. It just is too vague. It really makes no sense what we're talking about. So we have 2 terms that we use instead. I think you were nodding. Do you know what they are?
I remember like that there's a media line and stuff like that.
You're totally onto it. Yeah, she's got it. The person I would sit next to in an exam? No.
No.
So superior and inferior are the terms that we use rather than saying above and below. So I'm not a native English speaker, so I got to think about these things a lot. Plus also, and I'm blonde. I've got a lot of things working against me. It makes life difficult. So Think of when you're working somewhere and there's an organizational chart and your boss is your superior to you. They're your boss. They're above you. So the same term above refers to any body part in relation to another. So a good example of use of that would be that your chin is superior to your belly button. Rather than saying it's above, it's superior. And at this point, you're like, really, do I need that? You will need to learn that word. We will keep using that. And when we get to the nitty gritty, when we start talking, for example, about different parts of the heart, I will just assume we won't talk about it on this course. We'll talk on 202. But I'll just be like, oh, that's superior to this structure. It just becomes a second language to you. Inferior means below someone. Again, in an organizational chart, someone's inferior to someone, or especially in an army, military, you have a rank order. So do those two terms make sense? So you always need, excellent. You always need to have two structures that you're comparing. You can't just say that nose is superior. You need to say superior to what? Nose is superior to the chin. Chin is inferior to nose in terms of the anatomical position. When we think of this diagram, if I'm standing on my head here, which I'm not going to do, it's not going to work out pretty. Is my nose still going to be superior to my chin? Yes, because we always go back to this. She's got it. I love how you were like so committed. I'm going with this. It is true. So always, no matter in what position the patient is, and I go always to the gloomy case of dead patients who have lost limbs and stuff, we still talk about them as if they were standing in this position. So those two terms make sense. Let's add a little bit more. Front and back. So anterior and posterior. Are you able to see? Am I writing it in a really weird place? No, you're okay.
Yeah.
Let me know if you can't see or move around. I don't normally spend time in this classroom, so I don't know the good spots to write it. But anterior and posterior. So rather than saying that the nose is at the front of the head and your, I'm trying to think what, your elbow is at the back of the arm, you would say that nose is at the anterior part of the head and your elbows are posterior part of your upper limb. Does that make sense? Again, kind of just terms that we have to use. Now we get to your favorites. I know that my writing gets really sketchy. It's supposed to say close to midline and away from midline. And I will need this space. That's why I'm not writing there. You're like, why is it just not moving there? I'll need that space in a second. So that I'm going to logic there. Try. So when we're talking about the anatomical position again, we can think of that there's a line that runs through the human body, and you're almost like a mirror image on both sides externally. That's going to be our midline. So structures can be either on or close to midline, which would be medial, just what you were going to say. Or structures can be far away, or not even far away, but off from the midline, in which case they would be lateral. So medial and lateral. Let's think of a couple of examples of those. Your nipples are lateral to your belly button. your belly button is medial to part of your body. Make sense? Everyone's still good. That's a good quiz. There's 4 more that I want to add to this, but I am realizing that I probably wrote them poorly. Okay, if I jump, I'm trying to think where. I'll just jump here, but we'll leave a little bit of gap. Are you able to see if I right here? Yes. So if something's close to the origin or far away from the origin is what we're going to be looking at. And that might be a little hard to think about. So let's think about it a little bit. So the easiest way to start to think about this in my mind, and I'm sorry, I'm walking away from the microphone. Easiest way to think about it in my mind would be to think about your, for example, upper limbs. You can have parts that are very close to the origin where the upper limb starts, and parts that can be really far away from the origin. Does that kind of make sense? So we would say that, for example, your elbow is pretty proximal part of your upper limb. Your fingers, your digits are very distal part of the upper limb. So things like that. But that's not really how we mostly use these 2 terms. Where we end up seeing that we use these mostly is when we talk about, for example, of blood vessels. So this is not in your exam. I'm just trying to explain a concept, okay? So if we think that we have a heart, and my drawings are always sketchy. This is our heart, and every organ needs a blood supply. So similarly, heart, other than just putting blood away, it will need blood supply as well. So there's blood vessels that are called coronary arteries that carry blood to the heart itself and feed the heart muscle. And this is where these 2 terms would become very handy. If there's a blockage on one of these vessels, then it's that part of the muscle of the heart will not receive. Are you able to see? I didn't touch. I didn't really bad. That part will not receive sufficient blood and it will die. So if we have a blockage here, only this part will die. Not a big deal. If we have a blockage here, all of this will die. So when we're talking about blood vessels, we talk about, is it proximal or distal part of that branch? Or proximal or distal part of that blood vessel? Does that make sense why it would be important? So distal is not that big of a loss if it's just supplying a little area. If it is proximal, it might be. Yes?
Could that part receive blood again though?
That's a really good question. I'm going to answer it, but this is not in the exam. Okay. So what happens is that this happens a lot, but it depends how quickly we treat you. So you've heard people getting coronary artery bypass, right? That's when there's a blockage in one of those. And what we do, we surgically take a piece of blood vessel from somewhere else and build a bridge over that blockage, and they're fine now. Or we can go with a little bit like a, I'm being gruesome. It looks a little bit like a bottle brush. You stick it in, and it goes to one of these blood vessels, and we try to clear that blockage from there. Or we can even take this kind of a mesh-like tube that's very narrow when it's closed. We sneak it in to the heart, and then we expand it there and hope that the blood flows. So that used to be my job. So very good question. I'll give you your $20 after the class. No, really good question. it depends how long it takes before we treat it. We can also treat it with some medications that try to dissolve that blockage and so on. Yes?
So what defines the origin? Then is it close to the origin? For example, this was for arm, this is the origin?
Yeah, origin is the part that's closest in terms of, we talk about body parts or gross anatomy, the trunk of the body.
Trunk, that's what I
Yeah.
think. So, yeah.
But in terms of the blood vessel, it's the part where the blood vessel starts from. So really, you're asking really good questions. And you don't need to know anything about the heart in the exam, but that was me trying to explain the concept. But I love that question. Any other questions? Only 2 more terms that we need to include to this list. And I'm not even going to put definitions for these because I don't really know how I would define them. I said that I won't put a definition, and then I put it. So indecisive. So the 2 terms that I want to add to this list are superficial and deep. So superficial is close to the surface of a structure. Deep is far in there. Those kind of make sense, right? Can we think of an example that would be superficial in comparison to another body part? Skin is superficial. That's perfect. To muscles that are deeper. Perfect. So those are all the terms that are going to get us started. I'm looking for a different color. I got told that you should never write to students with a red pen. It upsets them. So I'm trying not to do it. Is anyone colorblind? No? And you don't have to share if you're, no, but I used to teach someone who was colorblind for red and blue, and talking about blood vessels, it got really hard. So let me know ahead of the time, not once you've struggled through something. So now we have these terms and we feel pretty good about them, right?
I have a question.
Yes.
I was gonna ask you, but I was like,
No, ask.
so the lateral, how would you like describe it from the midline? Like,
So lateral means further away from this line. So either, and it doesn't always have to be like what is lateral can be, it's all relative. You're comparing 2 structures. So your wrist is lateral. Your belly button is medial. Your nose is medial. Your shoulder is lateral. But then it gets kind of dodgy. You can start to talk about your eye is less lateral than your ear, even though it's not fully medial. Does that make sense? So there's a little bit of ambiguity on those. Good question. You're like already that, I'm going to challenge all this system. That's what I love. Keeps me on my toes. Okay, I promise we'll get to practice this in just a second. But now that we all agreed on this, I think it's time to muddle the waters, right? I'm all about, like, let's learn something and then point out why it's dumb. So this all works out great if you're a human. Anyone thinking of going to become a veterinarian or vet tech or something? It all gets messy when you're talking about animals that stand on 4 legs instead of 2. All this upside down. So we need to think about that a little bit, because I tend to ask about that in an exam, that, hey, why do we have 2 terms for similar thing? And that's because not all animals stand like humans. So let's talk about that a little bit. So we have terms cranial and caudal. So cranial actually means as a word towards the skull. So in a human being, it kind of makes sense that your superior part is also your cranial part. I was like, did I spell it correctly? I have dyslexia, so let me know if I misspell something. So it makes sense. Cranial and caudal is kind of makes sense in a human being. Think of a dog now standing. Their skull is not necessarily their most superior part, especially if they're digging their head to the sand or something. So that's where it gets messy. Caudal refers to your tail. You have a tail. The remains of the tail bones. Probably over time, evolutionary, I wouldn't be surprised if it disappears in the next 300 years, 400 years, maybe not. But we have a tail at the moment. So we use that tail to point like towards the inferior parts. Of course, it doesn't quite work if we talk about lower limbs, your ankles, knees, toes, stuff like that. Then it gets kind of tricky. So we don't really use caudal that much. But if you were talking about the dog again, and you're talking about structure that's caudal part of the dog, it's not going to be their inferior part, right? It's going to be more their posterior part. Did I confuse everyone? Or does it make sense here? And the cranial part of the dog is going to be more anterior than superior. So you kind of need to know these green ones, but we mainly use the black ones. But the green ones become important when we start looking at other animals and all that good stuff. Questions so far? I have a few other green ones to add to this story. So ventral and dorsal. Ventral refers on your belly side, and dorsal refers on your side where your spine is going to be. So ventral on a dog is probably going to be more inferior, right? Their belly side is facing down. Whereas on us humans, our ventral, our belly side is also our anterior side. I love when you're dorsal towards your spine is like your posterior side on a human. On a dog that's standing on 4 legs, dorsal would probably be more of a superior, right? So it gets messy. It gets so messy so fast and so soon. Only 2 more. External and internal. So external part is kind of same thing as superficial, and internal is kind of the same thing as deep. If you think in general, things can get muddled again, but at this point we can kind of consider them as synonyms. Were those terms familiar to you? Some had heard at least some of them. Is there anyone who's like, too many terms, I didn't sign up for language class? Yeah, I see nodding. Honestly, if you learn these, you will be using them for the rest of your time in medical. It's worth putting in the effort now. And more you keep using them, they become natural language that you'll use. Do you need a break or are you good to go on? Because I know that's been a lot. We'll carry on because we won't go too much further. Then we'll take a break, but I want to share one more thing. And like I said, for anyone attending online, I'll post those after the class, everything that we've written. So two terms that I think are going to be more intuitive than you think. Human body can be divided in two big portions. The axial portion covers your trunk, your head, and your neck. So kind of all the things that you can't live without. You can lose your limbs and still be alive, but you lose your head, not great outcome. You lose your trunk, not great outcome. You lose your neck from between them, not a great outcome. So the axial part of the body contains usually all of the vital organs, your brain, your heart, your lungs, stuff that you just need to live.
Only usually?
There can be exceptions in other animals. And that's why I was like, let's stay away from that. Yeah. In other animals, it can get a little bit more messy. But we're going to stick with it. On humans, axial part is the head, neck, and trunk. And appendicular part are all the stuff that are attached to that axial part that is nice to have, but you can live without. Have you ever applied for a job or filled in an application for a scholarship or something where they've asked you to include appendixes? Or you can enclose an appendix on your email, I think. So appendix is something that's added, that's not really part of the main thing, but it's an added thing. We all even have an appendix part of our intestines. Starting from the first part of the large intestines. It's kind of hanging out there. It's not really needed, but it's there. We'll talk more about appendix later on.
No one quite knows what it's used for.
We have good theories,
Yeah.
but we don't know for sure. I would still argue that it is an evolutionary remain. We used to need it. We don't need it now. But I'm not going to ask about that in the next time. But you look like you want to know what I'm thinking.
Right. Yeah, I remember having it.
So my theory would be that when we were, not in exam, when we were eating much more plants, we needed a special type of bacteria that is going to be digesting those plants. We needed a place to store it in the intestinal system, and that's where the appendix came in. We eat much less plant-based food now, so over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, it has started to shrink. And I wouldn't be surprised if it will disappear. There are, over evolution, there are some questions that could appendix be, well, you can remove your appendix if it gets inflamed and we just want to get rid of it. Appendix can get inflamed, so there are some theories that it might have some potentially beneficial functions in how your immune system works. So we'll leave that for the chapter when we talk about immune system in Bio202, and I will go into great detail about that. But I have a bad habit of mentioning something and it goes off rails. What I want you to know is the difference between axial and appendicular. Do we feel good about those? Perfect. What we're going to do at this point, we're going to take a quick break, about 5 minutes. And rather than me talking, we're going to get to practice all of these terms. You will need at least one skeleton per table. So there's a couple of extras, and you'll need one box per table. I will bring, probably from my home, because I have this stuff at home, more skeletons for the next time that we meet. These skeletons, the plastic things that you see, are what we use for all of our spot tests. So your spot test could be, and again, please don't stress about it. We'll do the first one together. But it could be that I'm asking you to put pins to certain structures, or put a dollop of clay to certain structures. And then I know that you know that. Or I might go and put stuff on your skeleton, and then you have to tell me what it is. It's like really, really small quiz, really quick. Not even size of a full piece of paper. I promise, I keep it easy. So the goal is that you do spot tests, like maybe it takes 5 to 10 minutes and so on. So we'll get to practice for what could be good questions in the spot test about terms once we come back from break. So let's take a 5-minute break and we'll continue then. And if you're joining us remotely, I'll try to show you on a camera pictures. You might need to share initially. Do you mind? She's super nice. This light thing messed me up. I don't know what I did and I didn't know how to fix it. We're just going to do with these lights. And for anyone joining online, thank you. If you didn't get a chance yet, please drop your name to the chat so I'll take your attendance from there. Today is the last day that we are on purpose doing this blended mixture of being in person, being online. Starting next week, we'll probably try to be in person. But if something happens, then I'll have. Thank you for that. We'll just take a real quick break and then we'll continue. I am so sleepy, like I can't handle this. So I'm really trying to psych myself up, if you're wondering why I'm like, I just struggle to stay awake. I finished teaching last night at 10:30. So, and I started at 7 today. So I'm already like ready to go to bed. I normally go to bed like at 8 o'clock. So it was tough class. In these classes, I'm just saying, like, while we're waiting, are we even missing anyone? Probably not. I'll just say in general, in these classes, I totally don't mind any questions at any time. And also, if I have a slide or a thing that I'm showing going too fast, just take a picture with your mobile phone. My students in other classes do that all the time. A lot of the time, I share answers, what might come up, and I try not to print, like, for example, an exam, every answer for you, because then it kind of loses the purpose. But if you want to take a picture, go for it. A lot of times students who use these models, once we start building more and more like muscles and stuff, students are like, oh, I'd really like to study that at home. And obviously it's going to be a little tricky for you to take it home. A, it's going to fall apart by the time you get there. And B, I guess I shouldn't do that. I'm not so worried about the B part, but I'm worried about the A part. But students take pictures when they do stuff on that. Initially, we won't do as much. We'll start with general terms, but once you get to build muscles, that's probably the most intense thing. I think I have some that my colleagues left. They were supposed to clean them. They built some muscles, but not all, and some parts of the nervous system. So a good example of your spot testing could be that I'd be like, okay, what is this muscle? And then you'd be like, oh, it's pectoralis major. But you haven't learned about that yet, so I wouldn't expect you to know. So that kind of things. The other reason why I do it, and I'm going to be honest, sometimes students don't show up to the class, but when they know that they have a spot test and they have to identify muscles from their skeleton, they kind of know it might be good to have those muscles in the skeleton. If you ever miss a class, I'll help you to make sure that you get to build them. So that's basically the idea. Has that been 5 minutes? Can we carry on? Yeah, let's just carry on. I ask and then I just do whatever I want. You should see the kids in our house. They have a hard time with that. I'm like, it's all about democratic decision making as long as I'm in charge. So I was raised in former Soviet Union, so we didn't have democratic systems. So I'm all about this, like too many choices. I just like dictatorship. Okay, here would be a great example what your spot test could be like. So work with a member or members on your table, or if you want, you can join forces on trying to figure out two structures. So here I've combined the two things that we've learned. We've learned all of these terms. And we've also learned the terms perpendicular and axial. So in your tables, please take that color of a clay dollop. It doesn't need to be big. There's boxes and there should be colored clay. If there's not colored clay, I have more. I have like clay to hand out. And mark two structures of the body so that you can illustrate this difference between two. So what did superior mean? Above. Inferior? Below. So now it's easy. Just put a green blob of clay to something that's above and something that's below. But I'm making it more difficult and find an axial part that's superior, an axial part that's inferior. Where is axial part? Head, neck, trunk. So work as a team in your table and go through, make sure you have one of each, because we'll go around and I'll ask examples. If you don't want to work alone, you can team up. If you want to work alone, I'm totally fine with that as well.
What's the point of reference, I guess? What's the point of reference superior to what? Like, where do we start with belly button? This is superior? Or?
That's why I was like, you have to have one superior and one inferior, because you just compare the two parts. Yeah, you always need to have two parts that you're comparing. So, and again, you can work independently or you can work together. It's up to you. I'll try to get so that everyone has all one. And if you don't have the clay color that you need, let me know. There's a lot on the floor here. There's 50 green. There's none. I don't think they got very far. I also measure. Oh dear, it's a funky. It's a funky one. But my goal is that you all have either, if you want to work alone, you have your own model, or if you want to work together, you have one green to share. And I know that this is really weird for those who are online, so I will come and show you stuff on the screen. Honestly, this is what my classes mainly do in A&P. They build clay stuff, and they're like, we didn't take parts. Isn't it weird? And it's really hard initially. If you work with it a little bit, human body here makes it soft. So when I'm building like a lot of stuff, like muscles, I have a sort of clay that I work with. And then it's easy to work. Try to find one for each of the 5. So you need 2 dollops for green. You need 2 dollops for red, because you're talking about structures. Good, you're onto it. And if you don't know the name of the structure, that's totally fine as well. I'm gonna be honest. This is your spot test question. So that's why I never throw curveballs. It seems to hurt.
These are easy jokes.
If anyone needs help, just let me know. I don't want to creep you out and be like on anyone's back. It looks awesome. You got it. You've got it. Oh, people do all sorts of things. They do eye colors and hairstyles and stuff. So further we get, when it's your one to work whole year, make it, customize it. And they do like jewelry and stuff. And I'm like, okay, you do you. You can totally do that. I'm all about do the work first, and then you can add anything you want. I've seen some amazing mohawks. Yeah, the colors are kind of, there's an orange and there's yellow. Is someone lacking orange clay? Because I think not all packets come with orange. If you have orange, you're good. Awesome.
The last one is the yellow one, right?
Yeah, yellow. Yeah. No, I kind of can't tell. This projector is especially bad. This is a little better. Yeah. But like, honestly, I'm secret to being a good teacher is that you can't see the back of the class. Like, I can barely see your face, so I never ask anything.
That's if I take my glasses.
Yeah. So we're just here in the class building stuff. I'm going to turn the camera around so you kind of can have an idea what's happening. People are just marking different parts of these plastic skeletons with clay dollops to kind of practice these terms.
Just like that.
I'm just going to go around so
I don't want to I'll let it slow down.
You're like right. You're going to do what?
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to lose.
Some good stuff. Looks like you've got it figured out. Great stuff. You definitely figured out. Good work. Excellent and good. I even sometimes do, if my students are desperate for it, I do group exams. So get to know your neighbor. If your fingers feel funky afterwards, you don't have to, but I'm just saying. Because I'm always like, I don't want to touch anything. Yeah. So just like, I have some really extra students who wear gloves when they do this, so they can fight gloves and bang, and they go, and I'm like, that's extra. That's extra.
You know when you're speaking on the chapter, the very first video that you cut, you said you're in an MRI. Yeah, I go there.
Oh, you go all the time?
Because I'm a patient transport at the hospital.
cool.
So I still have it all first, and I'm like, you can't go close to it.
But that's the best job to choose what you like. Because in no other job do you get to go to so many different departments to see what do I like? Do I like? Yeah.
It's a lot of, would it be radiation?
Yeah. And it's people here are super stressed out when you work. Oh, don't break our machine and stuff. But that's it.
Oh, yeah, you turn it off, isn't it like, it's a long time for it to like.
Yeah, and like you just you're more or you're in the same price range as an airplane. So you don't want to just mess up.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got some fun pictures. So we have had people going into an MRI scanner with a hospital bed that's made of metal. What happens when it flies in?
I saw a video, a photo of that. Actually.
You know exactly
Because I
what.
worked for Disney as well. And,
Oh, cool.
yeah,
Excellent.
I'm gonna see what that.
I love that. You're like, you can cover me. She's gonna cover
It
mine.
was cool, like, and they showed me, I had a test there,
Mhm.
and she showed me a photo of like a hernia disc on the back, and like how the disc is supposed to look like, and like when it starts curving in the little spinal cord, like that's how you know, like, depending on how bad it is, you might need surgery.
Yes. And honestly, what you're doing is the best way to get a taste of different fields and be like, I don't want to do that, I want to do that.
It's awesome.
So when you're doing good choices.
I see. I even go to the emergency department, and it's like hectic.
Oh yeah, it's
trauma.
y-
Because we
yeah.
are a trauma hospital.
That is so good practice though. I love what you're doing. No worries about reconnecting. Is everyone about finished? We'll take 2 more minutes and then we'll go through some answers. Did I freeze my entire thing? I probably did.